I still remember the exact moment my daughter-in-law looked me in the eye and called me a burden. And I mean exact. I remember the color of the tablecloth. I remember the smell of the rosemary chicken she had made. I remember the sound of someone's fork scraping against a plate in the silence that followed. It wasn't a private moment, some heated whisper in a back hallway that I could have dismissed or chosen to forget. It was in front of the whole family. Her parents, my son's siblings, my son's wife's mother and father. All 12 of us sitting around that long table in the kitchen I had mostly paid for. She looked right at me and said it with the calm confidence of a woman who had been meaning to say it for a long time and had finally decided the time was right. And my son, David, my only child, the boy I had raised from an infant, the man I had given 30 years of quiet sacrifice to, sat 3 feet away and looked down at the tablecloth like it had suddenly become very interesting. I sat with that for exactly 3 seconds. Then I stood up, picked up my purse, and left without crying. I did not cry for a long time after that. What I did instead was open a folder. My name is Margaret. I am 72 years old, and I live alone in a 2-bedroom apartment in Scottsdale, Arizona. I chose Scottsdale 3 years ago, after my husband Harold passed away, because it was close enough to my son's home in Tempe that I could be part of his life, but far enough that I had my own. Harold and I had spent 38 years together in a house in Phoenix, raised David from scratch, built a life that I was always genuinely proud of. Harold was an engineer, methodical and careful, the kind of man who kept paper records of everything and explained every financial decision to me as if I were his equal partner, because he believed I was. When he died, the grief was profound. But I was not lost. I knew our accounts, our investments, our insurance policies. I knew where every document was. Harold had made sure of that, and I will be grateful for it until the last day of my life, because that preparation turned out to matter more than either of us ever imagined it would. In the months after Harold passed, I grew closer to David in the way you sometimes do with your children when something enormous happens, and you are suddenly just 2 people standing in the same wreckage. We had always been loving but not especially close in daily terms. He was busy, I understood that. His career, his marriage to Christine, their life in Tempe. But after Harold, we talked more. We had Sunday dinners. He checked on me. I found myself looking forward to those calls and visits in a way that probably revealed how lonely I had become. And somewhere in that tenderness, somewhere in that new closeness, I started doing what comes naturally to a woman who has spent her whole life as a caretaker. I started quietly filling in the gaps. I need to tell you what that means, because it is the whole engine of this story. Filling in the gaps sounds modest. It sounds like paying for the occasional dinner or slipping someone $50 on their birthday. That is not what I mean. What I mean is that I became, over the course of 9 years, the invisible financial foundation of my son and daughter-in-law's life. And I did it so quietly, so carefully, so completely without fanfare, that the woman whose entire existence rested on top of what I provided had no idea I existed in that capacity at all. She thought she was standing on solid ground. She was standing on me. Have you ever held something up so steadily, for so long, that the people above you forgot there was anything holding them at all? Have you ever been so present in the practical sense and so invisible in the emotional sense that you started to wonder if both things could possibly be true at the same time? If you've felt that, I think you'll understand what I'm about to describe. And if this is your first time hearing a story like this, stay with me, because I promise it goes somewhere you'll want to be. Before I go further, I want to ask you something simple. If these stories reach you, if they feel true in some way that matters, please subscribe to this channel. It is completely free, and it is the thing that keeps these voices in the world. Leave me a comment right now and tell me where you're listening from. I love knowing that. I love knowing who is on the other end of all of this. Now let me tell everything from the beginning. David is my only child. He is 44 years old and has worked in commercial real estate in the Phoenix area for about 15 years. He is not a bad man. I want to say that clearly and keep saying it, because the easy version of this story makes him the villain, and that is not quite right. David is a man who let things happen that he should not have let happen. He made choices that were weak and ultimately harmful, but he is not cruel. He loves me. I believe that. I just also believe that love, for some people, is a feeling they carry without translating into behavior, without asking what it requires of them day to day. He felt love for me, and he also allowed his wife to treat me as though I were furniture. Both things were true, and the distance between them was the wound. Christine, his wife, is 41. She works in marketing for a regional health company, and she is, by most external measures, successful. She is organized, well-dressed, confident in social situations, the kind of woman who always has a plan and a timeline and a clear sense of what she deserves. I had respected that about her in the beginning. I genuinely had. I thought David had married someone with real spine. I thought she would push them both forward and they would build something solid. What I did not fully understand, not for years, was that her confidence was partly built on a fiction that David had built for her, piece by piece, starting before the wedding cake was even cut. The first large transfer happened in the second year of their marriage. They were looking at condos in Tempe, near a neighborhood called Hayden Ferry, where the new developments were going up fast and the prices were moving faster. A good 2-bedroom in that area required a down payment of roughly $130,000 to $150,000 to make the monthly mortgage manageable on 2 salaries like theirs. David mentioned in a phone call one Sunday that they were close but not quite there. He said it almost as a statement of fact, not a request. But I heard it for what it was. I talked to Paul, my financial advisor, a man Harold and I had worked with for over a decade, and the following week, I wired $142,000 into David's personal account. He told Christine it was money from a bonus he had received at work, supplemented by savings he had been quietly building for years. I found all of this out gradually, over time, in the careless way that people reveal things when they think the other person has already forgotten. I want to linger on that moment for a second, on the decision to wire that money and say nothing. Because I've thought about it many times since. I've gone back to that kitchen table in my mind, me sitting there with my coffee and my reading glasses and Paul on the phone, and I've asked myself, what were you actually doing? And the honest answer is that I was doing the thing I had always done. I was smoothing the path. I was removing the obstacle. I was being, in the most literal possible sense, the mother. Not in the sense of controlling or interfering, but in the sense of absorbing difficulty so the people I loved didn't have to feel it as sharply. That is what I had done for David his entire life. Whenever something was hard, I found a way to make it less hard. I had done it so many times that it had become reflex. I didn't think about whether it was wise. I thought about whether he would be okay. And so they got the condo, a beautiful 2-bedroom in a new building with a shared pool and a gym and a rooftop terrace they used on weekends. I visited twice in the first year. Christine showed me around with genuine pride, her hand sweeping across the open kitchen, the high ceilings, the view of the mountains from the living room window. She talked about how they had worked so hard for it, how they had saved and planned and made sacrifices. She said all of this with the ease of a person describing her own story, because that was, as far as she knew, exactly what she was doing. I stood in her beautiful kitchen, the one my money had made possible, and I smiled and said it was absolutely lovely, because it was. I remember standing at their kitchen window that first visit, looking out at the pool area below and the mountains in the distance and thinking, Harold would have liked this. He would have leaned against the counter and nodded with the satisfied expression he got when a plan came together the way it was supposed to. He would have asked David about the HOA fees and the building's reserve fund, because that's the kind of thing Harold asked about. And David would have said, "Dad, we looked into all that." And Harold would have said, "Good, good," with the small smile that meant, "I trust you." I stood at that window and I felt, genuinely, something close to happiness. Not pride in myself, not even pride in David, but a simpler thing. Relief. The kind that comes from watching someone you love land safely. That was 9 years ago. In the 8 years that followed, I gave them money in 11 separate significant instances, plus a small number of additional smaller transfers that I categorized in my own records as miscellaneous household. The amounts ranged from a few thousand to over 60,000. Let me walk you through the main ones, because I think the accumulation matters. I think hearing it in sequence is the only way to understand how something this large can also be completely invisible. About 2 years after the condo, Christine decided she wanted a different car. She had been driving a practical mid-range sedan that she had bought before the marriage, and she had her eye on a BMW 5 Series, the kind that runs close to $900 a month on a financing plan. David called me one evening sounding stretched thin. He said Christine had her heart set on it, that she worked incredibly hard and deserved something that reflected that, and that they were a bit tight right now with some other expenses. I said I understood. I wired 6 months of payments up front as a lump sum, and then I set up an automatic contribution to a joint account David and I had established after Harold passed, an account I had created specifically for him, which quietly covered the ongoing payment month after month. Christine drove that BMW for 4 years. She referred to it as her car, her achievement, something she had chosen because she had earned it. The renovation came in year 4 of their marriage. They had an idea to expand the second bedroom, put down new flooring throughout, and open up the kitchen into a proper chef's space with an island and new appliances. They had a contractor's estimate and a design plan from someone Christine knew through work. The full job came to $68,000. They had roughly $12,000 in savings designated for it. I covered the balance. That time I told David directly, "This is from me and your father's money." He said he understood. He said he would tell Christine it was a gift from both of us, from funds Harold had set aside. What he actually told her, I believe, was something considerably more vague, something that left her with the impression that a modest family contribution had helped them finish what they had mostly funded themselves. Because when Christine described the renovation to people, she talked about the decisions they had made, the materials they had chosen, the contractor they had managed carefully. She talked about it as a project they had executed, which in the practical sense they had. But the money was mine. There were vacations. Their 5th anniversary trip to Costa Rica, 2 weeks at a resort on the Pacific coast, which I helped fund to the tune of $12,000 after David said they had an unexpected expense overlap that month. A trip to New York for Christine's birthday, which I didn't fund directly but covered indirectly by sending David a general transfer around that time, labeled in my records as miscellaneous family support. A long weekend in Sedona that came up when Christine mentioned to me directly, almost casually, that she wished she and David could take a little trip before the holidays, but things were tight. I put $3,000 in David's account the next morning and said nothing to either of them about it. There was the medical bill. David had a health issue 2 years ago, something with his back that required a specialist and a procedure that ran outside what his insurance covered well. He didn't tell Christine because he didn't want her to worry. He called me instead. I paid the out-of-pocket costs directly to the provider, over $9,000, and told him to take care of himself and not to stress about it. He said, "Mom, I don't know what I'd do without you." I said, "You'd figure it out. But I'm here, so you don't have to." There was Christine's continuing education program. She enrolled in a project management certificate course at a local college, which she believed would help her advance at work. The cost was about $4,000 for the semester. She registered, attended a few weeks, decided it wasn't what she expected, and dropped it. The tuition was non-refundable. David asked me quietly if I could cover it because he was embarrassed to tell her he didn't have the money available without dipping into their emergency account, and he knew she'd feel guilty. I covered it without another word. There were smaller things too. Things I didn't always label precisely in my records because they felt too minor at the time, but added up in ways I didn't track carefully enough in the early years. A dishwasher that broke and needed replacing. A water heater that gave out during a cold snap in January. And David called me on a Saturday morning sounding frantic because they had house guests coming that weekend, and the repair would cost more than they could absorb without moving money around. I sent $1,500 by the end of that same call. A set of dining room chairs Christine had wanted, because the ones they had were secondhand, and she was hosting her work colleagues for dinner and felt embarrassed. David mentioned it to me almost as a joke, as in, can you believe she wants new chairs for one dinner? And I could hear underneath the joke that he wished he could just give her the chairs. I put $1,200 in the account that week. I never said anything to Christine about it. She got her chairs. She hosted her dinner. She probably told her colleagues about the great deal she'd found. I want to be honest about something I've had to reckon with in all of this looking back. I didn't give entirely without expectation. I told myself I did. I rehearsed that story to myself for years. I give freely. I ask for nothing. I need no credit. But there was something I was asking for, even if I could never have named it at the time. I was asking to matter. Not to be praised or thanked publicly, just to matter. To be seen as someone who was woven into the fabric of their life, not as a peripheral figure who showed up occasionally and needed to be managed. I was giving money and hoping, in the quietest possible way, that the giving would translate into belonging. It didn't. That's the thing about invisible giving. It can't create visible belonging. Those are two different currencies, and you cannot exchange one for the other, no matter how much of it you accumulate. By the time that October dinner happened, my total had reached $312,000, a figure I had calculated myself on a yellow legal pad the previous spring, sitting alone at my kitchen table on a Sunday morning, working from memory at first, and then from the printed statements I had started pulling. I had not set out to calculate it. I had just been sitting there with my coffee and my accounts, the way I always did, and something made me add it up. And once I started, I couldn't stop. Each item appeared in my memory with perfect clarity: the date, the amount, what I had told myself it was for. I wrote it all down in columns, neat and straight, the way Harold had taught me to organize numbers. When I totaled it, I sat with the result for a long time. Then I folded the paper and put it in an envelope and put the envelope in my desk drawer. And I told myself it didn't change anything. They were my family. I gave because I loved them. The amount was not the point. I believed that. For a while longer, I believed it. But something had shifted in me without my full awareness, and I think it had been shifting for longer than I wanted to admit. Because by that spring, the comments were no longer occasional. They had become the texture of being around Christine. It had started subtly, the way these things always do. A remark at Thanksgiving 2 or 3 years into their marriage about how I was a little behind on technology. A comment at Christmas about how my opinions on their finances were sweet, but I didn't really understand how things worked anymore. A redirect in conversation whenever I spoke at a family gathering, the kind where someone hears the beginning of your sentence and then smoothly steers the room to a different subject before you've finished. None of these things were dramatic. None of them would have held up as evidence of anything in a court of human opinion. They were just the accumulated effect of being treated, persistently and consistently, as someone who was present but not quite relevant. The phrase that crystallized it for me was, "You just can't keep up with modern life anymore, Margaret." Christine said it the first time in front of David's sister Linda, in the context of a conversation about smartphones and some new app that Christine was enthusiastic about. I had asked a reasonable question about how it worked. Christine answered it with the patient, slightly elevated tone of someone explaining something to a child, and then finished with that sentence like a period. She wasn't trying to be cruel. That was the thing I kept coming back to. She wasn't performing meanness. She genuinely believed it. She had developed a settled picture of who I was, what I was capable of, what my place in the ecosystem of their life amounted to. And in that picture, I was an elderly woman who needed things simplified for her and who contributed nothing of substance to anyone. I drove home from that dinner and I sat with it for a long time. I've read enough in my life to know the word for what Christine was practicing without knowing it. Ageism is the word. The assumption that because you are older, you are automatically less capable, less relevant, less worth listening to, less worth seeing. It is one of the last acceptable prejudices, the kind that people practice openly in polite company without embarrassment, because it feels like common sense rather than bias. She was not a cruel woman. She was a woman who had absorbed a set of ideas about old people without ever examining them, the way we all absorb ideas that go unexamined long enough. And she had applied those ideas to me with a kind of cheerful certainty that was, in its own way, more exhausting than outright cruelty would have been. At least cruelty knows what it is. What I noticed, in the months after the modern life comment, was the way it changed how I moved inside their world. I started editing myself before I spoke. I would form a thought, test it against what I imagined Christine's face would do when she heard it, and often decide not to say it. Not because the thought was wrong or unworthy, but because I had learned that offering it would cost me more than keeping it to myself. I had developed, without fully realizing it, the habit of a woman who has been taught that her voice has a limited and provisional welcome. I know that sounds dramatic. I'm telling you it was quiet. It was one small withdrawal at a time, one redirect, one patient correction, and then the next, and the next, until silence had become my default, and I had stopped noticing the cost of it. The dinner for David's sister Linda's birthday, 8 months before the October dinner, was the moment I should have done something. About 15 people around a table at a restaurant in Tempe, a nice Italian place where Linda always had her birthday because she loved the bread. Christine's comment about elderly parents and burdens was directed at the table generally, at the abstract conversation, not at me specifically. But it was unmistakably about me. She said something about how hard it was when older family members couldn't manage their own situations and expected the younger generation to step in. She said she thought it was important to maintain boundaries. She said she and David had worked very hard to be financially independent, and they couldn't take on additional projects. She said the word projects. My son, 3 seats away, nodded once in a way that meant I agree, and I'm not going to make a thing of it. I drove home and sat in my parking garage for nearly 20 minutes. I sat in that parking garage and I did something I had never quite done before. I said the numbers out loud, to no one, in the dark. 142,000. The BMW, ongoing 14 months. 56,000 for the renovation. 12,000 for Costa Rica. 9,000 for the back procedure. And on from there. I said them in the dark of my car, and I listened to them, and I tried to reconcile the numbers with the word projects. I couldn't. The two things couldn't occupy the same space at the same time. A project was something that needed managing, something that used resources, something that cost you energy you'd rather spend elsewhere. I had not cost them a single dollar. I had been moving money, for years, in one direction only. But she had used that word, and my son had nodded, and I had driven home alone. That was the night something settled in me. Not anger exactly, not yet. More like the slow lowering of a temperature. The kind that happens when a body decides it has been warm enough for long enough and begins, quietly, to conserve. I didn't make any decisions that night. I drove upstairs, made chamomile tea, watched a nature documentary about the Sonoran Desert that I found peaceful, and went to bed. But something had changed in me at a level below decision-making. And I believe now that the Sunday morning 3 months later, when I got out the legal pad and started adding up the numbers, I was not acting suddenly. I was completing a process that had been underway since that parking garage. The legal pad was just the moment the temperature hit its final setting. I want to stop here for a moment. Because if you are someone who has been in a version of this situation, if you have given yourself quietly to people who then couldn't see you clearly, I want you to know that what I'm describing is real and it is recognized and it is not something you imagined. The slow erasure of a caretaker is one of the most common and least discussed injuries in family life. You are allowed to feel it. You are allowed to name it. If hearing this story is doing something for you, please subscribe to this channel. It costs nothing, and it is what allows these conversations to keep happening. Tell me in the comments if you've ever felt invisible in your own family. I think more of you have than anyone talks about out loud. I need to talk about what that particular kind of invisibility does to you over time, because I don't think people who haven't experienced it can quite understand it from the outside. It isn't dramatic. It doesn't come with a single incident you can point to and say, "There, that is when it happened." It comes in layers, the way sediment builds, one thin deposit at a time, until one day you look at the thing that's been accumulating and realize it is substantial, it is heavy, it has been pressing on you for longer than you knew. The invisibility I'm describing is the invisibility of the person whose value is never acknowledged because it was never supposed to be visible. I was the infrastructure. Infrastructures are not acknowledged. They are assumed. You notice them only when they fail. What I had not quite reckoned with, not fully, was that by making my contributions invisible, I had also made myself invisible. Not just to Christine, who never knew, but to David, who did know and had still somehow managed to see me as peripheral, and I have to admit this honestly, to myself. I had been performing a version of selflessness that was, at some level, a way of not requiring myself to be seen, because requiring it felt like too much to ask. That is the particular trap of the woman who was raised to give without taking, to support without demanding, to love without accounting. It feels virtuous from the inside, and it is, in its way. But it has a shadow. And the shadow is this. If you never require anyone to see you, eventually they don't. The October dinner. I have to tell it carefully because every detail mattered in its own way. It was a Saturday. David and Christine had invited both sides of the family for a general gathering. No particular occasion, just one of those dinners that people in their 40s host to signal that they are the generation running things now. Christine's parents came from Mesa. Gary and his wife came from Chandler. Linda and her husband drove in from Surprise. Me from Scottsdale. 12 of us total. I arrived with a bottle of wine David had once mentioned he liked, and a card for Christine because I was raised to bring something when someone opens their home to you. Christine had made a real effort. The table was set beautifully, proper cloth napkins, a low centerpiece of white flowers, good candles. The rosemary chicken was already filling the apartment with a smell that made everything feel generous and warm. I found my seat at one end of the table, between Gary's wife Karen, whom I've always liked, and Christine's father, a retired postal worker named Frank, who told long stories about fishing that I genuinely enjoyed. I made my peace with the room. I had become, by then, very skilled at making my peace with the room. Dinner went well for most of its length. The conversation moved the way family conversations do when everyone is making a reasonable effort. Sports, a neighbor's new addition, someone's promotion, children's school events. I talked with Karen about a novel we had both read. I listened to Frank's fishing story. I ate the chicken, which was genuinely excellent, and I said so to Christine. She thanked me with a crisp smile. The candles burned down a little. Wine was poured a second time. I thought, this is fine. I can do this. This is fine. Dessert arrived, and Christine's mother made a comment about how costs had risen everywhere, and it was genuinely hard to maintain a home these days. Christine agreed and added something about how unexpected expenses always seem to come in clusters, that the condo had required more maintenance than they'd anticipated recently. I said, in what I believed was a warm and supportive tone, that I completely understood that property had a way of costing more than the initial estimate, that Harold and I had experienced the same thing over the years, and it always evened out eventually. It was the most neutral thing I could have said. I was trying to connect. I was trying to be useful. Christine set her fork down. It was a deliberate motion. She turned toward me with an expression I had not seen before on her face, or rather I had seen pieces of it over the years but never assembled so completely. It was the expression of a woman who had made a decision. She said, in a voice that was clear and even and completely audible to every person at that table, "Margaret, I appreciate that you share your thoughts, but you don't really understand our financial situation. You never have. You don't contribute to this household. You've never contributed anything meaningful. We are the ones who manage everything here. We're the ones who carry this. You show up, and you occupy space, and I say this because I think it's time someone was honest with you. You are a burden. We need space, not another project to fund. You need to understand what it means to carry your own weight, because the rest of us have been carrying ours and yours for long enough." I remember every word of that, not because I rehearsed it afterward, because the human mind records certain moments with a fidelity that has nothing to do with intention. It simply keeps what it needs. The table was perfectly still. Gary had stopped chewing. Linda's hands were flat on the tablecloth. Frank was staring at the centerpiece. Christine's mother had closed her eyes briefly. And David sat 3 seats away looking at the space just below the centerpiece, his jaw tight, his shoulders very slightly forward. The posture of a man who has chosen, in this exact moment, to not exist. I sat with what had just happened for 3 full seconds. I counted them inwardly without meaning to. Then I did the following things in order. I placed my napkin neatly on my chair. I stood. I said thank you to everyone for a lovely evening. I said goodnight to Gary and Linda by name. I thanked Christine for the chicken because it had been genuinely good. I picked up my purse from the hook by the door where I had hung it when I arrived, and I let myself out. I walked to my car in the October evening. The air was still warm, the way Scottsdale evenings are even in fall. I started the engine. I adjusted the mirror. I drove home. I did not cry. I want to be precise about that. Not because it makes me sound strong, but because it was a genuine surprise to me. I had spent years dreading some version of this moment, years of sitting in my car before dinners and reminding myself that I was welcome, that I was loved, that I belonged there. And now it had happened. The exact thing I had been quietly dreading had happened in front of 12 witnesses, and I felt, more than anything, a strange and weightless calm, like a knot that had been pulled tighter and tighter for years had simply been cut. I drove the 20 minutes back to my apartment on the freeway with the radio off and both hands on the wheel. And when I got home, I sat in my good chair by the window and looked at the Scottsdale lights for a while. And then I went to my desk and took out the legal pad. The next morning was a Sunday. I was up at 6:30 as I always am, made coffee, and sat at the kitchen table. I called Paul, my financial advisor, at 9 o'clock when I knew he'd have his cell on. I told him I needed to pause all recurring transfers associated with David's accounts, effective immediately. He asked if everything was all right. I said yes. I was making some adjustments and I would be in touch. He said he'd have it handled by Monday morning. Then I called my bank directly and confirmed that the automatic payment covering the mortgage contribution on the Tempe condo, the one that had been coming out of that joint account like clockwork every month, was stopped. The bank representative walked me through the confirmation steps with the pleasant efficiency of someone who has no idea what any of this means in human terms. I thanked her. I hung up. I finished my coffee. After that, I pulled up my records. I printed every bank statement from the past 11 years that contained transfers to David's accounts, to the joint account, to any address or reference associated with their household. I had kept good records, always, because Harold had trained me to, and because some part of me had always known that numbers are the truest story. I printed the statements, all of them, and I spread them across my dining table, and I went through them with a yellow highlighter for amounts over 10,000. Then I went through again with a pen and wrote in the margins, in my own handwriting, what each amount had been for. Down payment. Car payment, 6 months. Car payment ongoing, 14 months. Renovation. Costa Rica trip. New York birthday. Sedona. Medical procedure. Tuition. Unreturned. Miscellaneous household. Various. When I was done, I ran the total. $312,000. I had calculated it correctly from memory back in the spring. I took the whole stack to the copy center near my apartment and made 2 complete sets of copies. I put one set in a manila folder and kept it in my desk. I took the second set to my attorney, Patricia, a woman I'd been working with since Harold's estate, and I left it with her along with a handwritten note explaining the situation in plain terms and asking her to hold it in my file for now. She called me the next afternoon and said, "Margaret, this is quite a document." I said, "Yes, I know." She said, "Whenever you're ready, I'm here." I said I appreciated that and I'd be in touch. I did not call David that week. I did not send a message. I went on with my life, which is a thing I had been slowly learning to do more deliberately. I walked my neighborhood each morning at 6:30, the route I had established after moving to Scottsdale, down to the park with the big fountain and back. I went to my Tuesday library discussion group, which that month was working through a novel set in New Mexico that I found engrossing. On Wednesday, I had lunch with my friend Evelyn at a Mexican restaurant we both liked, and she knew something had happened because I'm not good at pretending nothing is wrong with people who know me well. So I told her a version of it, and she held my hand across the table and said, "Maggie, that woman has had this coming for a while." I said, "I know." She said, "What are you going to do?" I said, "Wait." Linda texted me 2 days after the dinner. She said, "I'm sorry about Saturday. What happened was not right, and I want you to know I don't agree with any of it." I replied, "I know. Thank you for saying so. Please don't make it bigger than it needs to be right now." She said, "Of course. Whatever you need." That was Linda. She has always been the steady one. Gary called the following Tuesday. He's David's younger brother, a quiet man who works in construction management and has never been one for large emotional conversations. He said, "I've been thinking about Saturday." I said, "I know." He said, "You handled it well." I said, "I'm not sure I handled it at all. I just left." He said, "Sometimes leaving is the handling of it." He asked if I was okay, and I said yes. I was fine, genuinely. He said he was going to talk to David, and I said, "Please do, but don't make it a war. I'm not trying to make it a war." He said, "I know. You're not that kind of woman." Which was kind of him to say, and true, I hope. The 3 weeks I waited between the dinner and David's phone call were not difficult in the way I expected. I had thought that stopping the transfers and then sitting in the silence of it would feel urgent, would press on me, would demand resolution. Instead, it felt strangely peaceful, the way the morning after a thunderstorm feels, when the air is washed clean and everything is quiet. I went about my life. I watered my plants. I read. I cooked dinners for myself that were proper meals and not the half-effort things you make when you're eating alone and can't quite justify the effort. I made soup from scratch one evening, a thing I hadn't done in months, and I sat at my kitchen table and ate it with good bread and a glass of wine, and I thought, this is a life. This is my life. And it is enough. David did not call for 3 weeks. I noted this with something that was not quite surprise and not quite the opposite. I thought about what those 3 weeks must have been like in that Tempe condo. The mortgage notice arriving. The car bill generating a balance. The contractor he had been talking to about some additional work sending a message about the deposit that hadn't come through. I thought about the conversations they were probably having. The careful circling around where the money usually came from. the dawning realization of what pausing adjustments actually meant in practical terms. I tried to imagine Christine's face when the first notice arrived. I found I couldn't quite picture it. Not yet. He called on a Thursday afternoon at 2:45. I was reading in my good chair. I let it ring twice and then answered. He started with small talk, which I allowed because I understood its function. He asked how I was. I said fine. He said that was good. He said the weather had been nice. I agreed that it had. Then he cleared his throat. He said he was calling because there seemed to be some issue with the accounts, that the mortgage payment hadn't gone through, that the bank had sent them a notice, and that he assumed it was probably a technical oversight on my end and wanted to check in. He said it with the careful, almost gentle precision of a man who is trying to pretend he is asking a casual question when he is actually asking the most important question of his life. I said, "It's not a technical oversight, David." I said, "I made some adjustments to my accounts." He was quiet for a moment. He said, "What kind of adjustments?" I said, "I stopped the transfers." There was a long pause. He said, "All of them?" I said, "Yes." He was quiet again for longer. Then he said, "Mom." I said, "I'm here." He said, "Can we talk about this? Can Christine and I come over?" I said, "Yes, come Saturday afternoon." They arrived at 2:00. Christine was wearing a light gray blouse and had her hair pulled back, the way she does when she wants to look composed. David looked like he had not slept especially well for several days. I had made tea and put out a plate of shortbread cookies because I am still a woman who was raised right, and old habits are not always things to break. We sat in the living room, David and Christine on the couch, me in my chair. There was a manila folder on the cabinet next to my chair. Neither of them asked about it yet. David began. He said he wanted to first acknowledge that the dinner had not gone the way it should have, and that what Christine had said was not acceptable, and he was sorry he hadn't said anything in the moment. He said this to the middle of the room rather than directly to me, which I noted but did not comment on. Christine sat beside him with her hands in her lap and her eyes on her hands. She did not speak at first. David went on. There was the mortgage notice, and the car bill had a balance now, and the contractor had sent a message about a deposit. He wasn't accusing me of anything, he said. He just wanted to understand what was happening. I said, "I'll explain it in a moment. First, I'd like to show you something." I reached into the cabinet and pulled out the manila folder. I set it on the coffee table and opened it and turned the first page toward them. I said, "These are my bank records." I said, "I'm going to put them on the table one at a time, and I want you to look at each one." What followed was the quietest 10 minutes I have ever sat inside. I laid the pages out one by one, not rushing, not with any drama, the way you might deal cards at a careful game. Each bank statement, each highlighted transfer, each amount with my handwriting in the margin. David leaned forward as I laid them down. Christine's posture changed. She went from sitting straight to sitting forward, elbows on her knees, the way people do when something is pulling them toward it, even when they'd rather stay back. Page after page. Down payment, $142,000. Car payments, first 6 months lump sum, plus 14 months of the ongoing contribution. Renovation balance, $56,000. Costa Rica, $12,000. New York, indirect. Sedona, $3,000. Medical procedure, $9,300. Tuition, $4,000. Miscellaneous household transfers, various amounts over various years. At the bottom of the stack was the summary sheet. 1 page. The total, printed and then circled in ink, $312,000. I placed it last. I smoothed the edge with my thumb. I looked at Christine. I said, "I was the burden, and the burden has been funding this home for years." Christine's face went through things I had not seen it go through before. The color left first, quickly, the way it does when something hits the body before the mind has processed it. Then a kind of stillness, The stillness of someone whose internal landscape has just been rearranged and who hasn't had time to make sense of the new map. Her mouth opened once and closed. Her eyes moved across the documents on the table, not frantically, but with a kind of deep and dawning attention, as if she were reading something she had not known existed and could not stop reading now that she had started. David put his face in his hands, a grown man, sitting on his own mother's couch, crying into his palms. The sound was quiet but unmistakable. I sat with it. I did not rush to him. I let it be what it was. After a moment, he lifted his face and looked at me and said, "Mom, I'm so sorry." His voice broke on the last word. He said it again, more quietly. "I'm so sorry," Christine said, in a voice I had never heard from her before, smaller and stripped of its usual confidence. I didn't know. She said it plainly, without drama. Just those 3 words. And I believed her. That was the complicated thing. I did believe her. She had genuinely not known. David had managed the information between us so carefully for so long that she had been living inside a story that had very little to do with reality. Her confidence, her certainty, her entire understanding of what their life had cost and what they had built had been constructed on a foundation she had never been shown. I said, "I know you didn't know. I'm not sharing this to make you feel ashamed. I'm sharing it because I think we all needed to see the same picture at the same time." I said, "I didn't give this money to hold it over you. I gave it because I wanted David to have a stable life, and because I couldn't stand watching things be hard when I had the means to make them less hard. But what I've understood lately is that all of this giving, in secret, in silence, created a version of me in your mind, and in David's mind. That wasn't real. And I let that happen. I was part of it. I'm not only the victim of this situation, I was also someone who chose silence when I should have chosen honesty. David said, "The dinner," what Christine said. Christine said, "I want to say something." She looked at me directly for the first time since they had arrived. She said, "What I said at dinner was wrong. It was cruel. I said it because I was frustrated and I wanted to feel superior to something, and that is not an excuse, it is just an explanation, and I am sorry." She said it with her eyes on mine and her voice steady in a way that took real effort. I could see the effort. I said, "I accept your apology." I said it simply without qualifications, because I meant it. I told them both, the transfers are not resuming. I want to be clear about that. This is not a negotiating position and it is not a punishment. It is just the truth of where things are now. You are both adults with good incomes. You can manage your own finances. I know it will require adjustments, and I know some of those adjustments will be uncomfortable, but you'll make them. David nodded. He said, "We will." Christine said, "We will figure it out." They stayed for about an hour after that. We drank the tea, which had gone a little cool, and we talked in the way that people talk after something enormous has been said and survived. It was not cheerful exactly, but it was honest in a way that none of our conversations had been for years. When they left, David hugged me at the door for a long moment, longer than he usually did. Christine, who had never been a natural hugger with me, put her hand briefly on my arm and said, "Thank you for letting us come." I said, "Of course." The practical adjustments they made in the following weeks were real and relatively rapid. They refinanced the mortgage at a higher rate, which cost them more monthly but allowed them to fully own the obligation. Christine took on 2 freelance clients she had been putting off, additional marketing work she did in evenings. David picked up a consulting project that kept him busy on weekends for a couple of months. The BMW was traded in for a vehicle with a monthly payment that fit within their actual income. None of this happened dramatically or with announcements. It just happened. The grinding, ordinary way that people adapt when the cushion is gone and reality is what it is. About 3 weeks after the Saturday meeting, Christine sent me a text message. It said, I've been thinking about what you showed us. I want you to know I understand now how wrong I was. Not just about the money, about how I treated you. I thought for a while before writing back. Then I wrote, "Thank you for saying that. I mean it." Because I did. I have no interest in prolonging suffering once the truth has been acknowledged. Grudges past their usefulness are a weight I don't need. I've got better things to do with whatever time I have left, and there's a lot of it. I plan to be around for a good while yet. Things are different now. Not transformed, not a movie ending. Just different in the specific ways that real life offers as its version of resolution. I see David and Christine for Thanksgiving and Christmas and a few other occasions through the year. I go when I want to go and leave when I'm ready to leave, which is a freedom that sounds small but is, in practice, enormous. Christine and I are not close. I don't expect we will be. But we are decent to each other with a kind of weight behind it now. The weight of people who have said hard things to each other and kept showing up anyway. She asked me for my apple cake recipe at Easter. I wrote it out by hand and mailed it to her. She sent a card saying it turned out beautifully. The card is on my refrigerator. That is where we are. David and I have lunch about once a month now, just the two of us. At a diner in Tempe he has liked since his 20s. It is not deep or confessional, our lunches. We talk about work, about Linda's kids, about something I read, about something he's watching. There is an ease there that we didn't have for a long time, perhaps because the pretending is gone. He doesn't have to manage information between us anymore. I don't have to sit across from him wondering what he has and hasn't told his wife about where their money actually comes from. We are just two people eating lunch, and there is something genuinely good in that simplicity. He picked up the check last month without saying anything about it, just reached for it naturally, and I let him. That was its own kind of milestone. There was one more thing Christine said to me, about 2 months after the Saturday meeting, that I've thought about quite a bit since. We were at Thanksgiving, the first big family gathering after everything had happened, and the room had a kind of careful lightness to it, the way rooms do when everyone has agreed to try. After dinner, when people were helping with dishes, Christine and I ended up side by side at the sink, her washing, me drying, for about 10 minutes. She didn't say much at first. Then she said quietly, almost to the dish she was rinsing, "I keep thinking about what kind of story I was telling myself. About us, about our life, about what we'd built." I said, "I know." She said, "I didn't know it was a story. I thought it was just true." I said, "Most of us think that about the stories we're inside of." It doesn't make you a bad person, Christine. It makes you someone who had bad information. She nodded. We finished the dishes. I thought about it all the way home on the freeway, that 10 minutes at the sink, and I still think about it. It was, I believe, the most honest exchange we have ever had. What I reclaimed in all of this was not a relationship. It was not a new dynamic, not an apology that undid years of being invisible. What I reclaimed was something more fundamental than any of those things. I reclaimed the right to exist in my own family as what I actually was, rather than what the silence had allowed people to imagine. I had been the invisible foundation of a life I was then told I contributed nothing to. I had watched my money build a kitchen where I was later told I was a burden. I had funded a car that carried a woman to dinners where she described elderly people as projects, and I had let all of that happen by being so relentlessly, so completely silent, that I had effectively disappeared. There is a cost to giving without being seen. Not just a financial one, though that is real. There is a cost to your own understanding of yourself. I had spent so many years smoothing things over, absorbing difficulty, filling in gaps invisibly, that I had begun to believe the character in Christine's story. The one who didn't contribute, the one who couldn't keep up, the one who occupied space without adding value. It had seeped in. I'd be lying if I said it hadn't. You hear something said calmly and confidently enough times by someone who has no apparent reason to be wrong, and you start to check yourself against it. You start to wonder. The bank statements cured that. Not because they proved my worth to anyone else, but because they proved it to me. Holding those printed pages, seeing the numbers in my own neat columns, running my finger along the highlighted amounts, I felt something settle back into place inside me that I hadn't realized had come loose. I was not invisible. I had never been invisible. I had simply arranged my own erasure through a decade of generous, loving, well-intentioned silence. And when I stopped being silent, the silence itself became the story. I think about the women who are living the version of this I used to live. They are everywhere. They are sitting in church pews and at family dinners and on the phone with their financial advisors, quietly making transfers and telling themselves it doesn't matter. It's just love. It doesn't need to be acknowledged. They are driving home from gatherings where someone said something that stung and letting themselves believe maybe they were wrong to be stung. They are building lives for other people and being labeled useless by those same people and finding reasons to believe both things simultaneously. I was that woman. I know her from the inside. And what I want to say to her, from the deepest and most specific place I have access to, is this. You are allowed to open the folder. You are allowed to place the papers on the table. You are allowed to say calmly and without drama what is actually true. You don't have to be cruel. You don't have to make a speech. You just have to stop allowing the silence to be the only story anyone tells about you. Harold would have been proud of me, I believe. He was a quiet man, but he had no patience for dishonesty, especially the comfortable kind. The kind people wrap in kindness so no one has to look at it directly. He would have done what I did years earlier. He would not have waited a decade, but I think he also would have understood why I waited, because he loved me well enough to understand that some women spend their whole lives learning the same thing he had simply always known. You can be generous without being erased. You can love your children without funding their inability to see you clearly. You can give without making the giving invisible, because making it invisible protects no one in the end. It just delays the reckoning. I think about Harold at his kitchen table, the way he would sit with a yellow pad and a cup of black coffee and a mechanical pencil and go through our accounts the first Sunday of every month without fail. He didn't find it a burden. He found it clarifying, the way some people find exercise clarifying. He believed that knowing exactly where you stand is one of the most fundamental acts of self-respect. He used to say, "Maggie, the numbers don't lie. They are the one honest record. Everything else can be argued or misremembered or dressed up different ways, but the numbers just sit there and tell the truth." I learned that from him. I learned to keep records and to read them without flinching, and that practice, that unglamorous habit of paper and pencil, turned out to be the thing that gave me back my life. I am 72 years old, and I live in my own apartment in Scottsdale, Arizona. I walk my route every morning at 6:30, down to the Fountain Park and back. I attend my Tuesday library group. I have lunch with Evelyn on Wednesdays. I call Linda on Fridays, and she makes me laugh without fail. I manage my own accounts with the precision Harold taught me. I talk to Paul once a quarter. I am completely, genuinely, irrevocably fine. More than fine. I am present in my own life in a way I had stopped being for a long time. And the sensation of that, of being the person most fully inhabiting her own days, is not something I plan to give up again for anyone. The legal pad is still in my desk drawer. I haven't thrown it away. I've thought about it. But every time I open that drawer, I see it there, folded in half, my handwriting visible through the paper. And I leave it. Not out of anger. Out of something closer to respect. For the morning I sat down and made myself see what was real. For the version of myself who added up the numbers instead of looking away one more time. She deserved to be taken seriously. That woman at her kitchen table with her coffee and her reading glasses and her yellow legal pad. And she finally was. If this story found you today, If it sat down next to something you've been carrying and gave it a name, I am glad. These things need to be said out loud. They need to travel between people. If you know someone who is living inside this kind of silence, someone who gives and has started to believe the story that they contribute nothing, please share this with them. And if you haven't yet, please subscribe to this channel. It is free, and it is the thing that keeps these voices in the world. Thank you for being here today. Thank you for listening all the way through. Take good care of yourself. You have absolutely earned it. I want to close with something that has nothing to do with Christine or David or the $312,000. It is something I have been carrying separately, and I think it belongs at the end of this story. About a month after the Saturday meeting, I was on my morning walk, the usual route down to the fountain park and back. It was early, before the heat came up, the way October mornings in Scottsdale are, clear and almost cool. The desert light doing what it does at that hour, which is make everything look precise and unsentimentally beautiful. I was walking past the fountain, which was running, and I stopped and stood there for a minute listening to it. I thought about all the things I had told myself over the years to make the arrangement feel acceptable. I gave because I loved them. The money doesn't matter. Credit is for small people. What matters is that they're okay. I had said all of those things to myself so many times they had worn smooth grooves in my thinking, and I had stopped examining them the way you stop examining a familiar route. You just walk it. And I thought, standing by that fountain in the October morning light, every single one of those things was true, and every single one of them was also a way of not requiring more for myself. Both things were true at the same time. And they were not contradictions. And that was perhaps the most complicated thing I had learned in all of this. You can love someone completely and still require them to see you accurately. You can be generous to your bones and still draw a line at your own erasure. You can forgive a wrong and still decline to pretend it never happened. These are not failures of love. They are what love looks like when it is mature enough to include the person giving it. I wish I had understood that 20 years earlier. But I understand it now, standing at 72 in the October light with a fountain running beside me and a life that is, for the first time in longer than I can track, unmistakably my own. That is enough. That is honestly more than enough.